Every cyber attack leaves behind a trail, and one of the most valuable clues are the IP addresses and domains. Whether it's command and control servers, phishing domains, or malicious proxies. Analyzing this information can reveal who's behind an attack, how they operate, and even predict their next move. In today's video, I will be diving into cyber threat intelligence for IPs and domains. I will show you how analysts pull intelligence data from multiple sources, correlate it, and turn it into actionable insights. We will start with the basics. What kind of data you can extract from an IP or domain like geolocation, WHOIS info, ASN data, SSL certificates, reputation scores, and historical resolutions. Then we will explore practical tools and platforms that analysts rely on, from VirusTotal to passive DNS and even OSINT tricks. And here's the fun part. We will put this into practice using the IP and domain intelligence room on TryHackMe. Together, we will walk through real-world exercises, trace digital footprints, and see how professionals connect the dots to identify malicious infrastructure. Okay, so let's get started. Okay, a quick reminder on how DNS works. Every time you click a link or when your system translates a hostname, the domain name system jumps into action. DNS is essentially the internet's phone book. It translates the human-friendly names like example.com or whatever the domain into machine-readable IP addresses. Without DNS, the web would be far less usable because of its central role, DNS has also become a prime target for hackers who exploit its mechanisms to hide malicious infrastructure. Now, as SOC analysts, DNS data is one of the most valuable early warning signs or signals. Suspicious or newly registered domains often show up in alerts long before malware samples or file hashes become known. Hackers constantly register, configure, and abandon domains to stay ahead of defenders. So our task here when analyzing domain names or DNS names from the SOC analyst perspective is to identify who owns the domain, what IP addresses does it resolve to, how often does it change, does its behavior resemble a trusted content delivery network, CDN, or it's much more like disposable attacker-controlled setup. The first step here is to identify who owns the domain. We want context about the domain. Basically, we can do that using WHOIS. WHOIS tools are basically the go-to when we want to pull information about a specific domain name. Okay, so when we use WHOIS, what are the records we want to pull? Basically, we're looking to pull A records, NS records, MX records, and text records. And sometimes SOA records and TTL are bonus. So let's talk about these records in a real example. In the room, task 2, we're given a task file. If you download the task file, you will see it is a PDF report. So basically, how they got this report, they use a tool named nslookup.io, which is a tool that gives you information about the domain name, much like WHOIS. And the subject domain they used here is advancedipscanner.com, which basically is a legit IP scanner. And this is the official domain name of the scanner. So suppose that we saw this domain name in the logs or the alerts. What do we do? From the perspective of threat intelligence, first we want to pull information about this domain name by retrieving the records we talked about. First, we have A records. The A records will give us the IP addresses that the domain name resolved to. And a domain name could resolve into several IP addresses, which is actually a red flag here. Now, you see, in the A records section, we have two answers. Two answers give us two IP addresses. This is the first one, and that's the other one. These two IP addresses belong to this domain name. Again, the existence of several IP addresses is not a good sign, but you should treat it as a suspicious aspect of the domain name. It's not necessarily malicious. You should not treat it as a lone factor in determining whether the domain is malicious. Next, we have fourth A records. This is basically the IPv6 addresses. So here we have two IPv6 addresses that the domain resolved to. Next, we have the CNAME records. In our case here, the CNAME records correspond to Cloudflare, which means that this domain name is behind a content delivery network. In this case, it is Cloudflare. The text records holds information such as the SPF and DKIM. These records are responsible for verification and increasing this trustworthiness of a domain name. Now here you see, when text records are queried, we only see the records we saw earlier, the SOA, when we queried the CNAME. We don't see SPF or DKIM keys, which means that the domain name or the author of the domain name doesn't care about the trustworthiness, which is actually another suspicious aspect. Next, we have NS records. Again, we have records that point to the use of content delivery network. MX records allow us to find out what are the hosts that the domain name used to deliver emails. And here we see, again, they are hosted on Cloudflare. And at the end, other records such as the statement of authority, it's also on Cloudflare. These are the kind of information you want to pull when you do threat intelligence on domain name. Of course, nslookup.io is a tool. There are several other tools you can use. Some of them can be launched from the terminal, such as DIG or WHOIS. Now, let's answer the questions of this task. First question from the downloadable report: what are the IP addresses for the A record associated with our flag domain, Advanced IP Scanner? We already answered this question. We have 2 IP addresses here. And then what name server addresses are associated with the IP address defanged the addresses? So we have two name servers can be found under NS records. These 2 name servers can be defanged using CyberChef. You basically put in the domain in the input area and you get the output. And this is the answer. Before we start talking about IP address intelligence, let's first talk about RDAP, or the Registration Data Access Protocol, which is the most authoritative way to determine who owns an IP block. Unlike GeoIP databases, which sometimes may be commercial or provider marketing pages, RDAP information is directly maintained by the regional internet registries. So when we query an IP address using RDAP, what we get is the net range, the block of IP addresses allocated, the organization, the official holder of the block, could be Google, could be Meta, any additional remarks about the type of IP usage. Is it used for hosting, broadband, mobile? The abuse contact. If we believe the IP address is being used for malicious purposes, we get a mailbox for reporting malicious activity. And the thing is, RDAP is the reliable way of pulling information about an IP address. The next important aspect about IP intelligence is what's called as the autonomous system. An autonomous system is essentially a network, a collection of IP prefixes managed by a single organization. It's worth mentioning that each autonomous system has a unique identifier called autonomous system number. It is either 16-bit or 32-bit. For SOC analysts, examining the ACN helps determine how an IP is likely being used. So basically, we can get the hosting ACNs, the residential ISPs, and the cloud CDN ACNs. For example, hosting ACNs contain many small net blocks with different customers. And hosting ACNs are frequently abused by attackers to host suspicious domains. However, residential ISPs have huge IP ranges that serve millions of customers. Alerts here often point to compromised home routers or infected devices. Now, when it comes to cloud or content delivery network ACNs, since cloud covers global infrastructure, cloud providers can be AWS, Google Cloud, Cloudflare. Blocking an entire ACN here causes massive collateral damage. So SOC analysts must scope down to specific domains, pre-qualified domain names, or CIDRs. All right, there is an important piece of information that we always look to find when we do IP threat intelligence. What's it? The geolocation. Geolocation is important. However, SOC analysts must treat it cautiously. Why? Because country mismatches are common. Content delivery networks and cloud providers may register IP ranges in one country, but may serve the traffic worldwide. City-level data is unreliable. And of course, there are legal implications. If a host is in a cooperative jurisdiction, legal teams can pursue takedown requests via the abuse contact. Best practices, I guess, is use at least 2 sources. We have IP, info.io, or iplocation.net, and treat GeoIP just as a hint, not a definitive fact. So at the end, as a SOC analyst, when you do IP threat intelligence, you may want first to start with RDAP. Retrieve the net range, the organization, the ACN or autonomous system number, and abuse contacts. You can use command line tools such as RDAP followed by the IP address, or you can use rdap.org. The next thing you want to do is to add autonomous system number context. Add context to the autonomous system number. What does it mean? Look up ACN role. Is it hosting? Is it ISP? Is it CDN, cloud? You can use pjpview.io to determine that. Then you can pivot into geolocation, record the country from at least 2 GeoIP sources, and highlight mismatches. Then you can look for reverse DNS patterns because they reveal hints about the hosting type. And of course, you can consult the internal logs. Has this IP appeared before in the last 30 days? In what context it has appeared before? It's login, command and control, or phishing. And of course, if the IP is determined to be malicious, escalate to the abuse contact that you have found if the ACN belongs to a cooperative provider. Now, in TryHackMe Task 3, there are a couple of questions. Let's go over these questions. Open client.rdap.org and identify when this is the defined format of the IP address, was logged for registration. So if I open the client here, we talked about earlier, and we have a look at the IP, but we're going to put it in the original format. So basically, I'm going to paste this here and just convert it into its original format. When we query the IP address now, we get the information we talked about earlier, the address range or the net block, the network name, network type. In case it is here, this is direct allocation. And then we have the CIDR prefix, which tells us the net block, the number of IP addresses, of course, the status of the IP is active, and when it was registered. That's what's required in this task, I believe. The answer in UTC, first comes the time zone, MMDTY. Okay, so when was the I logged for registration? So that's the answer here. When you convert it into the UTC format, this is the answer. What roles are assigned to the entity NOC 2791 ARIN associated with the IP address? So you're going to have to take a look at the handles here, I believe, entities, and then handle limes2. What roles are assigned to the entity? So basically, you're going to have to locate this entity first. That's the entity here. And the roles are technical and administrative. So here, I believe first we're going to have to write administrative and then technical. So that IP is used for technical and administrative purposes. And then what's the country's name for the IP address? So I believe here using RDAP won't give you the country information. You're going to have to use a different tool. So to use a different tool, you can use a tool named IP location, or there are tools here that are referenced in the task. You can use ipinfo.io. This one I believe is not free. IP location is still free, so I'm gonna copy the IP here and look it up. So it is France. Now, can you identify the autonomous system linked with the IP address? To find the autonomous system number, we may have to use either pgbview or ipinfo.io. So using ipinfo.io, we paste in the IP address, and here we get information such as the ACN. So that's our ACN for this task, for this question. Now, if you try with pgbview, you may get an error. Let me just make sure this is correct. And yes, there's an error. So if you encounter an error using pgbview, use ipinfo.io. In task 4, the question here is, find which service is primarily associated with the IP address 85.188.1.133. So all we have to do is to copy the IP address and head to Shodan, search, just type the IP address in the search, first with the original format. And let's have a look here. So we have, these are the available host names the IP address is associated with. You see we have FTP, and this is HTTP rsync. This gives us information about the services hosted on this IP address, or the server hosting these services. We see also the domain name, the country, the city, and the web technologies. This is the web server type, light or light HTTP, and this is also the version, which is also important in pen testing. On the right, we see the open ports, and of course, we see binary grabbing for every port. For example, this is binary grabbing for the FTP port, and this is binary grabbing for the OpenSSH, which gives you the version number of the software used for hosting the service. Also, the same for light HTTP and other ports. Let's go back. Now, find which service is primarily associated with the IP address. The primary service here is, let's see, you see the domain name is scene.org. However, there are a lot of associations that may indicate that domain name is primarily used for FTP. We see ftp.nl.scene.org and ftp.scene.org. So the service here is, the primary service is FTP. How many ports have been identified as open on the server? You see we have 6 ports. Next, you want to find out what are the services the IP address is used for. You can do that using Shodan, which is a high-value reconnaissance engine for internet-facing assets. It continuously crawls and indexes services exposed to the internet, such as open ports, service banners, SSL, that metadata, the headers, HTTP headers, and device types. This makes Shodan ideal for answering questions such as which services does this IP address expose? Are there obsolete versions or misconfigurations? And which systems belong to a given organization? Now, in addition to Shodan, there is something called the certificate transparency. Certificate transparency logs and sites like CRT.sh are considered as gold mines for passive enrichment. Publicly trusted certificates are logged and searchable. This alone reveals domain ownership overlap, issuance patterns, and certificate issues. So there are important TLS fields we want to capture as part of IP threat intelligence. First, we want to find out who is the issuer of the TLS certificate. Who signed the cert? Is it Let's Encrypt, DigiCert, or whether it is a self-signed? A self-signed certificate may indicate a quickly deployed or a throwaway host. Next, we want to find out the validity period. Usually, short-lived certificates are actually normal. Let's Encrypt typically issues 90-day certificates. However, if we notice bursts of reissuance across many domains, this can indicate automated phishing or provisioning. And the last thing we want to find is the subject or the subject alternative names, the fully qualified domain names and wildcard entries the certificate covers. These are the primary pivot for mapping related domains. You can pull these information using a command line method and an online method. Command line method is by using OpenSSL s_client. This tool allows you to connect to the IP address, of course, after you specify the IP and the port 443. This is for TLS certificates, of course. Dash show certs, okay, and then you pipe the command to another command using OpenSSL to make the output human readable. This will pull information such as the issuer, the validity, and the subject. Another option is to use the online tool CRT.sh, which allows wildcard searches. Let's have an example. So this is CRT.sh. Let's input the IP and search. So there are no certificates found on this IP address. Now we see the available output options. If you click on JSON response, okay, looks like we don't get any answer. Let's go back. It looks like it is actually associated with the previous IP, with the previous question. Using search.census.io, identify the TLS certificate fingerprint for the IP address. Okay. This is also another tool to pull information about IP addresses, specifically TLS certificates. Let's now search. And these are basic information, DNS, and the services hosted on this IP address, FTP, SSH, HTTP. And scrolling down, we see HTTP 443, port 443, which means there is an actual TLS certificate associated with this IP address. The question is, using this tool, identify the TLS certificate fingerprint for the IP address. So if we go back and look for the fingerprint, this is the fingerprint we're looking for. Now, beside the fingerprint, we can find also the information we talked about earlier, such as the issuer of the certificate. Here, the issuer is Let's Encrypt. The subject, it's issued for archive.scene.org, and for the other names. All right. The last question is, according to CRT.sh, which holds the certificate logs, are there certificate transparency log entries captured associated with the TLS certificate identified above? So here, if we copy the fingerprint and use it, we get bad gateway. Let's go back. Let's try it just with the domain name, search, And we get, of course, certificate logs. These are called the certificate log entries. So the answer to this question is yes, yay. Now, after we have gathered all these intel, next we want to check for reputation. So basically, reputation feeds are a core part of enrichment. They help you quickly judge whether an IP, domain, or file is already known to be malicious, how widely it is seen, and what context, whether spam, phishing, malware, surrounds the IP or domain. Now, there are tools that you can use to check for reputation. First of which is VirusTotal. I guess most of you know VirusTotal. VirusTotal gives detection ratios for files, relationships between indicators, IPs, domains, and files. It also gives you historical sightings and community comments. All you have to do is to check. You can check an SHA hash, an IP or domain, and look it up. Next, you have Cisco Talos Intelligence. This platform gives you web and email reputation scores. It also gives you categorization, whether the IP, email is a spam, malware, or just benign. And it also gives you telemetry volumes. This is the dashboard view of a global email traffic trends. And with Cisco Talos Intelligence, you can also check for vulnerability scores and vulnerability write-ups, whether the IP or domain has been or was associated with a previous vulnerability. And lastly, we have IP2 proxy. This unique service, it labels or it gives you labels for IPs that are known to be used in VPNs, proxies, door exit nodes, or data center egress points. These labels are critical because shared egress points weaken direct attribution. Now let's have a look at task 5, reputation checks and passive DNS. In task 5, there are two questions. What file has been linked to the IP here? So first, let's check with VirusTotal as we suggested in the workflow. We can run the IP address here using the search. Of course, we need the IP in the original format. Now this gives us the AV associations or the detections. So basically we have only one detection out of 95. It's only 14 that classifies this IP as associated with malware activity. The next thing we want to check here is the details. So in the details, you see we have the autonomous system number we talked about earlier. And it is labeled as Bykov Ilya Sergeyevich. Then we have the HTTPS certificate information, this fingerprint. We can run this fingerprint in CRT tool to check for the certificate issuance logs. And then we have the RDAP data. Basically, this runs RDAP lookup on the IP address to give you information such as the net block, the network name, when it was last changed, when it was registered, WHOIS lookup on the IP. All these are intelligence we talked about earlier in the video. Now check for relations. We see passive DNS confirms we have 0 detections. However, in communicating files, you see we have 52 detections. This means that there is a malicious file, or could be a malicious file associated with this IP address or hosted on that IP address before. That's the file name, and that's the file we want for the answer of this question. What organization is identified on historical WHOIS lookups? Let's go back because in VirusTotal we can check for WHOIS lookups. In details, scrolling down, we see in the WHOIS lookups, the organization name here is ACE Data Centers Incorporation. So that's the organization we can see here. Okay, and lastly, we have a challenge where we wrap up everything we have learned in this video. Okay, so it's 9:10 on Monday. Over the weekend, Finance reported a burst of account verification emails that looked unusually polished. Your secure email gateway caught a subset. One clicked sample was redirected to santagift.shop. At the same time, your EDR shows workstations briefly beaconing to this IP address. Use the skills. Okay, so what's the RIR associated with the IP address here? So first, if you are looking to grab intel from an IP, the first thing we want to do is to run an RDAP query. So we use rdap.org and we submit the original form of the IP address. Let's have a look at the information we can pull. So this is the address range, the network name, server hub, Dallas. This is the CLDR, which gives us an idea about the net block size. You see here the registration time. It was registered on 15/4/2019, and it was also changed at the same time. Okay, these are the entities. Now we're looking for the RIR. Let's search for this. Let's go back. What is the RIR? So probably here we're gonna have to find the go back to the entity information, and from here we can check this. This is the RIR. Okay. Oh wait, sorry. Next, what ACN is the IP connected to? Now this way we can find the correct ACN number. Okay, so ACN name, Unix Corporation. Connectivity. So this is the correct ACN number. Identify the number of named server records for the domain santagift.shop. Okay, you're gonna copy the domain and check with DNS lookup. Okay, these are the IPv4 addresses. You see we have several IP addresses connected to this domain name. And these are the named server records. We have 1, 2, 3, 4. Which name server is identified as the start of the authority, SOA for the domain? Let's go back and check. So these are the DNS records. Scrolling down to the SOA data, we can find the domain or the name server that is identified as the SOA. And the last question is, when was the domain registered? Again, we can check with nslookup. If that didn't work, if you don't see any information about the registration date, you can check with WHOIS. Okay, let's find out. So the domain was registered on this date, 30 October. Okay, one more time, we're gonna have to find the correct formula for the answer. So first it's DD, so 30, that makes it, then we have 10, 2022. And that was it.